Dr. Henry is a product manager at Amnesty International, and she has significant experience in healthcare data analysis and is passionate about investigating the ethical and social impacts of technology and data.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. It's my first time in Canada. So I'm going to talk to you at a very practical level, but in the nonprofit space. So this is not necessarily deeply bleeding edge AI. It's about my work as a volunteer with DataKind UK. DataKind is a data science for good organisation. There are volunteer data scientists as a network, and they are matched with charities who have data or who have data problems, and we work on trying to solve those. And I'm one of the core volunteers. I'm currently leading the ethics working group, and I led on the development of our ethical principles, which are here. There's also our website. So one of the reasons to come in at this point, I think, is that charity organisations, unlike some companies, are actually trying to talk about this stuff in public. Also, the data scientists that we work with and that we want to embed ethical tools with in their day jobs, as well as the volunteer work. So it's covering a broad range there. And we have actually tried to use some of these tools that you see coming out for looking at ethics of AI or ethics of machine learning or data. And you often only see them being produced and being used by the people who authored the first paper. And we were trying to actually use these as tools, and I'll tell you the story of that and what we've learned so far. So the example project is one that went on through 2018. It's a real project. It was to create a predictive model for a regional food bank to identify users who are most likely to need extra support. And this was a project over about 6 or 9 months. There were 3 data scientists, volunteers working with the food bank, and the aim was to build either a prototype or an actual productionized model. So the previous system for this food bank was that they got a client referred by phone, so that was from a government or a church, for example. So they weren't collecting all the data. That's relevant. They prepare a food parcel, but if that client looks like they might need extra support by talking to a support worker about the underlying causes of needing to go to a food bank so regularly, then they can be referred to a caseworker. The charity wanted to do this better. They wanted to find people earlier who might need the extra support by using a predictive model. There are about 30,000 data points of data covering the previous 3 years. For a small food bank, that's actually quite good and data mature. So they wanted to predict that to find who would need it most. It's not an automated process fully. This is a suggestion for humans in the loop, which is very relevant for GDPR, and I think I get the first mention of GDPR for today, which is good. And it's fundamentally allocative in terms of possible discrimination. That is, you are giving someone something. It's not about representational harms. And it's assistive. We're not trying to punish anyone. They're not going to be stopped from getting food. And it's in the context of limited resources. It would be great if you could provide support to everybody who needed it, but they don't have the resources. So it's not for restricting anything, it's not for placing conditions, and it's not to share with other agencies, for example, government benefits departments. So one of the things that came up in building the model, which was a random forest, for those of you interested in those sort of things, is that ethnicity and birth country impacted dependency. And the data scientists mentioned this sort of casually at one of the catch-up meetings, and the charity were fine with it. The stakeholder was not worried about ethical implications. They were like, yeah, if that's what the data says, then we'll use that. But because DataKind had just built our ethical principles, including discussing and debating the ethical issues, the staff saw this as an opportunity to look at it and see how we could tackle this, and hopefully do it in a way that led to learnings. So we talked to the data experts, the charity. The country of origin that was particularly associated with dependency was Nigeria, and they were fine with that. They were like, yep, Nigeria is a country where there are people applying for asylum and refugee status in the UK, but because it's seen as a stable country, rightly or wrongly, they're not getting it, which means they're not entitled to work, they're not entitled to benefits. It's not surprising that they would become dependent on a food bank. The ethnicity case was pretty similar. It turned out to be Irish travellers in that case. There were a few very heavy users that were driving that. Now, that has issues for the resilience of the model, but it wasn't necessarily a problem about bias. So the charity were fine with it from a data side. We then talked to data science and ethics experts. So on our board, we have Fran Bennett from Mastodon. She's got a lot of expertise in the ethics of data science. And we thought through the what-ifs. What if we do wrongly predict which users need extra support? Well, if you predict someone should get it and they don't need it, hopefully that will be picked up pretty early. There'll be some resource loss, but it's not catastrophic. If you predict that someone doesn't need the extra support that would benefit, you've somewhat backstopped the harm by retaining the charity's previous rule, which in this case, by the way, was a very, very simple, you turn up 10 times, you get referred for support. So that's the status quo. We think we can do better than that using machine learning, but having it there means that the harm is inherently limited in that regard. We then talked about other harms that came up. What if you have to explain to someone why they're getting referred for extra support? How would you feel about saying that their ethnicity is a factor in that? What if it gets into the papers that, Irish become dependent on food banks in a sort of tabloid? These issues all come up, so you move to the representational harms. What if the use of the model is changed and they do start to ration support? You would probably want to have the conversation again in that case because you are no longer just talking about a potential benefit. So we went through all this and we ended up being pretty okay with the risks that we had defined. The model went through. It's currently in production. It's in testing, but it's been embedded into the existing system of the food bank. There's a recommendation to the volunteers, and assessing success is non-trivial in this case. For instance, you could do everything right, identify the exact people who need support. If there's nothing there, if there are not suitable jobs for them or not suitable benefit categories for them, there may be no downturn in the use of the food bank by those people. So assessing success is a difficult one from a practical data science perspective. From an ethics perspective, we're pretty happy with where this ended up. Can we change this from an ad hoc, the staff happened to be interested at that time, to a systemic process that helps charities and helps our data scientists do something in the day-to-day? This is where we started looking at tools partway through the project, but frankly, that's probably not uncommon in business as well. So this is not codes of ethics. There are a lot of them. But things that are meant to be operational. So things like checklists, see the D on data-driven checklist. There are various reporting templates around data and models. There are question sets, such as the machine intelligence garage ethics principle questions. And a much shorter set of the Not Everyone Agile ceremony, which I mentioned because Sam Brown's here and I think we'll talk about it later. And also there are code packages, which I'll get to later and we didn't engage with. That's just to give a flavour of what we thought about using. And we very quickly ran into problems whenever we started using any of these. Here's an example of the D on checklist. Informed consent. Well, that's great. That means getting the charity back together, going and talking to the people that refer clients to them to check if there might be any issues in the consent at that first stage, and then going through it. So you need to have the discussions. Communicating bias, yeah, we've done that pretty well. We can tick that one off. Redress, that's at the deployment stage. We're currently in the test stage. It may not make that much sense to have a plan for redress if you're not even sure that the model is going to be embedded in regular practice. So one of the problems we came up against was that these end-to-end solutions were really hard to actually use as reporting tools because you just cannot answer all of them at a given point in time. Sorry, this is the random animation that I didn't sort out. So data and data science came from across organisations and tools often assume a single source. There was a lack of committed time from the charity because we hadn't lined it out at the beginning. There was a lack of time from the data scientists. In this case, they were volunteers, but even in a regular business organisation or a government organisation, they're probably going to be moving on to other projects pretty soon after they've created the model and it's going into deployment. There's little way to report a risk accepting decision and report around this isn't completely unbiased, but we're okay with it and here's why and here's what we've put in place to check on that. The fundamental problem under all that is that we tried to do the ethics without taking any more of people's time. And so how do we choose tools better and what makes a good tool? It gives a common language to discuss possible impacts in society. In our case, that meant getting the charity on board with thinking about ethics in the first place at all. Encourages what-if discussions amongst multiple stakeholders. This is probably what I think is the most important one. It allocates resources, human time and effort and interaction visibly and across all teams. You can't just do it on the sly because someone happens to be interested, which was also reported in a recent survey published of, I think, 267 data scientists in the US. It also leads on to solutions, some of which will take more time. So it's not going to be a very simple thing. So then I thought about what sorts of ethics tools we'd found. So there's things like awareness building, which are sort of heavy front-loaded ones. There's enabling processes which are meant to be lighter and embedded. there's the packages, the tools that I call substituting. They're meant to be automating this ethics process, and we'll discuss why we mostly think that's not very useful. And then there's ethics for AI, making friendly robots. We won't be talking about that one, sorry. And we're going to suggest that the substituting one should be used with caution. So awareness building tools. If you want to know if you're looking at one of these, could it be run as a multi-stakeholder workshop at important milestones, so the start of the project? It's often a resource chunk. It's about getting everyone talking the same language and getting everyone thinking that there is an ethics problem to discuss. At the moment, these are often educating even about the very idea of having to look at ethics. They're often starting from a very low bar. What I'd argue is that you probably need one of these for every new project, even if you have a team with the ethics culture fully embedded, because there's always going to be nuance of user groups impacted that might have particularly cultural needs. There's always going to be nuance in the data, where you might have a particular data source that has its own inherent biases that you have to address, or a particular language in an NLP project. So the idea of an awareness building tool that you run as sort of a chunk of lots of people getting together and talking together, hopefully face to face, is something that we want to go on with, and we hope to choose one for every ongoing project. I have some examples up there. The Machine Intelligence Garage Ethics Principles, which I was on the working group that helped build. There's probably about 50 or 60 of them. It's not sustainable to do it in a really lightweight way for every change of a project, but as an upfront, let's think about what we have to think about, potentially really useful. And also obviously things like actual getting users in the room. So we want one of them. We also want an enabling tool, and this is the sort of process, agile type approaches to finding ethical concerns. So for those of you who aren't from that background, Agile is a term from software development, where the idea is that you have fast iterating cross-functional teams and work is made visible. It's often talked about in terms of the speed of delivery of development projects, but what we want to use is one of the co-benefits here, particularly of visible work. That is, you set aside time in traditional Agile for doing a retrospective, which is not actual coding time, but it's looking at what went right and wrong and trying to improve. You set aside time for solving technical debt so that the coding will go faster in the future. If you set aside visible time for ethics, then you will get benefits. And these need to be light questions that you can ask every reporting period and report back on every reporting period. So an example is the .everyone consequence scanning ceremony, which consists of 3 questions. Maybe you could choose 3 key questions out of the Machine Intelligence Garage set and ask them for the developers at every interaction. Now, substituting tools. These are dangerous. Things like the AI Fairness 360 tool from IBM promise to let you solve fairness in 1 to 2 lines of code. You can look at some ranges and say, hey, it's all fine, without really understanding what you've done. And they let you avoid deciding on which fairness metric by sort of doing compromises that try to address all of them. And if you try to substitute for human thought and not use any extra resource, we say you probably are trying to solve a socio-technical problem with purely technical means, and it's not going to work. So here's an example of AI Fairness 360. In this case, it's looking at US census data, and surprise, surprise, in 1994, the US census data predicted that men were more likely than women to make more than $50,000 a year. Also that whites were more likely to. So then you get a one-click option in their interactive demo to mitigate that and make it the same. And my question is, I guess, why would you do that? And why would you think that is the right thing to do with the census data from 1994? So what if we ran this for the food map? Find out that country of birth has an impact. We'd be told that it should not, because IBM has its information that the ideal answer is 1. You can imagine a charity or even data scientists who haven't thought this through being very tempted to hit the next mitigation button in the algorithm and get it to a point where it doesn't matter what your country of birth is. Now, we know, because we had the discussions, that that's not what the data experts want. They want there to be an effective country of birth because that's real. But if you gave them one button to click and promised that all the bars would get within the green line, would they do it? I think there's a really strong risk that they would, and it would make their model and their outcomes worse as a consequence. So these are not altogether unuseful. They're useful if you've spent the resources in all the other tools, you know exactly what you're doing, you know exactly which fairness you care about and which bias you're looking for, and you run this tool as an automated way to check, for example, a new version of the model or a new data input to the model. Then it's useful. That's great. I have no problem with using these tools then, and I think often the creators envisaged that they'd be used that way. It's just that there's a really high risk that they won't be. We need to run risk assessment on the risk tools. And that my sort of summary of this is the You can't get this without resource. You can't not slow down development or have any new meetings and still be fair and ethical in your AI application. And one more thing, Agile sort of assumes that AI development is like software development, that it can be fast, it can be iterative and failable and prototypable. What if it's not? There are other models out there. What if a better analogy is urban development, where there are wide impacts, it's hard to reverse, and there are unforeseen interactions? That's really slow. There are community consultations, there are last-minute blockers to urban development projects, there are lots of regulations and standards, and everyone accepts it takes time. My own corporate history in healthcare, again, there wasn't actually that much discussion about ethics because there were rules about going through a review board before you used patient-level data and having an aim for your model and having that signed off on and knowing that that was going to take a few weeks of extra time. So the idea that we have to go as fast as possible is not necessarily one that I'm endorsing just because I'm saying that we should use these Agile tools. What's State of Kind going to do in future? Allocate resource for ethics explicitly for both an awareness building tool as early as possible, but including the charities, data scientists and users. Using a lightweight Agile style enabling tool throughout the process so that the data scientists involved can report on that at every case and we can react as necessary. Could this be a single tool? I'd like to think that we could do something to do that. I haven't seen any at the moment. We're going to avoid using the substituting tools except for very narrow cases where we really know what we're doing. One of our core volunteers is a PhD student of Luciano Floridi, and she's working on these tools. We could probably use them pretty safely if she's involved, for example, but we know we need to use them with caution. But the key point is allocating resource, not getting something for nothing. Thank you very much.